The war in Ukraine has definitely weakened Russia. It's weakened the Russian economy. It's weakened the global perceptions of Russia as a military power. We spoke about that in terms of Russian arms sales. It's made Russia more dependent on China, right? And the Chinese, as I said, have not gone out of the way to provide military supplies to the Russians. They've been very careful not to get caught in American sanctions. They haven't really provided much financing to Russia. Again, very careful not to get caught up in Russian secondary sanctions. So they've not been particularly buying assets in Russia. What they have been doing is buying commodities cheaply off Russia, exploiting Russian weakness.
Looking at the reach that there is around the world and trying to put this into geopolitics, we've seen Russia's effectively being pushed out of the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and how that's potentially impacting Africa. What is the relationship between the Russian economy and its reach into Africa and oligarchs? And I'm going to try and look at that into the axis of evil as well, and then into the BRICS organization.
Yeah, I'm not sure necessarily that Russia's sort of move into Africa, or you could say Syria, was necessarily economically driven. I think it was all to take strategic advantage. You could look at Putin's pivot into Syria in 2015. It was to get leverage with Europe, right? I mean, if you think back to that period, the Assad regime was on the back foot. There was a lot of optimism. You could have seen regime change there. In the end, Putin intervened, propped up the regime, and you end up with this huge migrant flow out of Syria that obviously destabilized Europe and has been part of the rise of the far right, populist movements in Europe, right, on the anti-immigration feeling. So Putin did that because at the time, if you remember, he wasn't particularly winning in Ukraine. He did it to extract leverage, and also I think we saw that in Africa. I mean, I think it was a Russian foreign minister once said, Russian foreign policy is all about going around the world creating problems and then offering to clear them up. It was Gromykin, obviously. Gromykin, I mean, it's a classic line. I think that's the reality. That's how Putin sees the world, right? He goes around trying to create problems for the West, which gives him leverage on what he really cares about. And what he really cares about is Ukraine. No, Putin. I think it's important to think that Putin wakes up every day thinking about how to screw Ukraine, how to get Ukraine. He's obsessed with it. And that's why I think, when you look at Trump's peace deal, this idea that you could, forcing Ukraine to surrender territory for peace, Putin will not be content with a peace in Ukraine unless he gets the whole of Ukraine, unless there is no Ukraine. So it shows a fundamental lack of understanding of Putin and Russia by the Trump administration. I think Europe has finally got it. Fortunately, for whatever reason, European leaders, I think, finally get the existential threat from Russia and from Putin to Europe, which is why they're not going along with the Trump narrative.
Yeah, well, it's taken them a while. But then now, putting your Russia into other contexts, how important do you think is this unofficial relationship that there is between Russia, Iran, China, North Korea? And is it a sign of desperation, do you think, that Putin is relying on them, especially North Korea, for a lot of its military material that he needs to support his tactical operations?
Well, lots of interesting angles there. I would probably argue the fact that Putin had to rely on troops from North Korea and munitions from North Korea reflected two things. One is his own weakness, the own inability of the Russian military to generate enough troops and kit, whatever, to defend its Kursk, the Russian Federation. And secondly, that the Chinese probably weren't doing enough, or they weren't doing what the Russians expect in this partnership with no limit. So, I mean, a lot's made of the sort of Putin-Xi relationship and the fact that obviously Xi is in Moscow today for the victory parade. But actually, I think the Chinese have been quite careful to calibrate, how much support they've given to Russia, not to undermine the core relationship for China. And the core relationship with China is not Russia. The core relationship with China is the Americans, right? And so they played the war in Ukraine, the Chinese, to kind of, provide the minimum amount of support to Putin to kind of keep him in power without annoying the Americans too much. And that's actually, I think, why Russia ultimately went to North Korea for troops and munitions. And I don't think the Chinese were particularly enamored with that. I mean, China wants to dominate that relationship with North Korea. It's nervous about North Korean nukes, right? And I think Putin probably put Xi's nose out of joint a little bit by that deepening in the Russian-North Korea relationship, right? And you mentioned Iran, and that's another angle, and another kind of complication. I mean, very interesting what's going on now with the US, the Trump Iran kind of peace effort through Oman. Obviously, Iran has been pretty important in supplying drones to the Russians against the Ukrainians. You would hope that the Americans would be putting pressure on Iran as part of that peace deal to limit their military supplies to the Russians. But a lot can go wrong still in terms of that peace process. And at the moment, I guess we've had this alliance: China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. But also we have this, I don't know, this new one, which is Trump's reach out to Putin, presumably because ultimately the Americans are worried about the hegemonic battle with China, right? So again, this whole, this could all be thrown into disarray in a way by Trump himself.
Yes, and the other relationship that Russia's got is of course with BRICS. So you got Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and lots of other countries have joined it. Does Russia get any real value from that grouping? Because it's more coherent than the Iran, China, Russia, North Korea relationship, because it's more of a formal grouping, or is it? Is it a coherent organization, or is it just a bunch of states coming together to see what they can get individually out of it?
I think BRICS is really just a very nice acronym. It doesn't really do anything, and it's not really achieved very much at all, apart from perhaps to annoy the Americans, which may have been one of the reasons for its creation. I mean, if you look at the BRICS itself, I mean, two members, China and India, they're often almost at war, right? So there are rivalries, tensions inside this entity. We saw that in terms of when there was discussion about the enlargement of BRICS, bringing Iran in, pretty extraordinary. Clearly, for countries like South Africa and Brazil, that would be a complication, obviously, because of their relationship with the Americans, right? So I don't think BRICS brings very much at all to the table for Putin. It's not a source of financing. Again, it just annoys the West a little bit, or it puts the Americans' nose out of joint, which Putin likes doing things like that.
Yeah. Now, coming back to China and Russia again, what sort of price do you think Xi Jinping is extracting from Vladimir Putin for his tacit support? Is China effectively buying swathes of Russia where there are natural resources in some of the sorts of deals that they've done through Africa and elsewhere? Or what's in it for China?
Look, I mean, we can go back to the full-scale invasion. I mean, there's debate about whether, Putin told Xi. I have my doubts. I think the invasion was irritation initially for Xi. It destabilized global markets. The Chinese don't like that. They love globalization. They like the global status quo. Anything that pushes oil and commodity prices higher is not helpful for the Chinese. So I don't think they knew about it. They were a bit irritated, I think, at the start. But then I think they saw some advantage in an extended war. I think, firstly, they thought it distracted the Americans, obviously, from the Asia theatre. It meant that the Americans and the Europeans had to expend a lot of energy supporting Ukraine, and it weakened the Russians. And I think, if you go back to the Beijing Olympics, there was signs of tensions between the Russians and the Chinese, because I think the Russians saw the partnership with no limits as a partnership of equals. I think Xi never saw it like that. Xi saw China as the big brother and Russia as the weaker partner. And I think the war in Ukraine has definitely weakened Russia. It's weakened the Russian economy. It's weakened the global perceptions of Russia as a military power. We spoke about that in terms of Russian arms sales. It's made Russia more dependent on China, right? And the Chinese, as I said, have not gone out of the way to provide military supplies to the Russians. They've been very careful not to get caught in American sanctions. They haven't really provided much financing to Russia. Again, very careful not to get caught up in Russian secondary sanctions. So they've not been particularly buying assets in Russia. What they have been doing is buying commodities cheaply off Russia, exploiting Russian weakness, and getting a great deal on a lot of cheap commodities on offer by Russia, because Russia has been trying to avoid Western sanctions. So that's been the big benefit. So I mean, the Chinese don't mind an extended war as long as as I said, it doesn't impact global commodity prices or destabilize global markets. If it keeps Russia as the junior partner in the relationship, they kind of like that. And as long as it keeps the West kind of occupied supporting Ukraine, again, they kind of like that. Interestingly, they got very nervous around the Prigozhin affair. They were very worried when Putin seemed to be close to being forced from office. And it seemed at that point they were perhaps thinking about stepping up support for Putin at that point in time. But then obviously we know Putin survived, Prigozhin had that terrible accidental air crash, and the rest is kind of history.
Well, yeah, and China's always looking for an opportunity. I think what we may see here is China trying to step up and take over the gap that the Russians have left in the international arms market and start to fill that with Chinese technology, because they haven't really been out selling their weapons around the world, allowing the Russians to do it. Mind you, a lot of the stuff that they got is Chinese copies of either the Russian kit or Chinese copies of Western kit. So it'll be interesting to see where that happens. But looking at that and changing tack completely from an economic perspective, Donald Trump has been very clear in what he's been doing in trying to put pressure on the West to step up economically in its defense budgets and everything else. Now, the pressure that he's put on Europe and NATO members to increase their defense spending, but also to increase their defense industrial bases, has created a competition in defense sales capability that wasn't there beforehand. And then Trump comes out with statements, or his team come out with statements restricting the use of American-supplied weapons in different areas, therefore undermining the confidence in the US arms market around the world. Do you think Trump has effectively shot himself in the foot in the arms market by creating this lack of confidence in US suppliers, and then forcing Europe and other countries around the world to increase their capacity and their production capacity?
Look, the Trump team are very quick to argue that they were right about Russia and right about the fact that Europe wasn't pulling its weight in terms of spending on defence. This NATO 2% target, obviously it's been increased. And as someone who, yourself and others have argued, about the existential threat from Russia for a decade. I mean, unfortunately, European politicians sat on their backsides and didn't do anything about it. We should have been, the annexation of Crimea should have been a wake-up call. And I actually find it pretty extraordinary when you think about it that, we've had 3 years of a brutal war in Ukraine, when it should have been absolutely obvious what the threat from Russia was. And it actually took J.D. Vance's visit to the Munich Security Conference in February for the pennies to drop, or the pfennigs, or the euro cents. I don't know what you call them these days, but yes, the euro cents to drop, and finally the Germans to realise that actually we cannot rely on on the US to backstop European defence. And thank God for J.D. Vance's visit. He spoke about the fact that, I think what was interesting about J.D. Vance's visit, he mentioned that there are different values between the Trump administration and Europe. And I think actually now Europe is realizing that Europe and the US not only, or Trump administration, I should say, and Europe not only have different values, but different interests. The number one national security threat to the Americans is China. China is very low down the list, I think, for Europe. Russia is top of the list. And, I think finally Europe has realized that they have to develop an autonomous defense capability. Unfortunately, it takes time, right? I mean, we can talk about going from 2% to 2.5 and 3% of GDP defense spending for European NATO, but we lack the military industrial complex. We lack the troops. It takes time. And this creates a time problem, right? I mean, yes, we can, Europe is a huge economy, 20 or 27 trillion or something. It's a big economy. To rival China and Europe, we will get our acts together. We will build that military industrial complex. We have the technology, we have the finance, we can do it. But it will take 10 years to find replacements for Patriot missile systems or HIMARS or ATACMS. It will take time. And two things are important there. Firstly, that the Americans continue to supply us enough weapons for us to defend ourselves against the Russian threat in the short term. We hope they do. We hope they still will, sell the kit to us. And the second one is that Ukraine lasts out long enough. We have to, Ukraine has to buy us time. And, if they lose, Russia will, the two biggest military industrial complexes in Europe now are Russia and Ukraine. You put those together, that is an overwhelming threat to Europe, right? We cannot let that happen. So we have to hope, again, the Ukrainians survive long enough to buy us time that the American suppliers kit to bridge this gap until we get our own autonomous defense capability, right? But I think it's just fact. We cannot rely on the Americans. NATO is really dead. That's the harsh reality, right? And we think about UK's own nuclear deterrent, our independent nuclear deterrent. I mean, we're dependent on US Tomahawk missiles. A lot of our technology and our own nuclear deterrent. In the end, we rely on the Americans. You mentioned a lot. A lot of the kit we use ultimately is under license one way or another from the Americans. So we're in a very, very difficult position, and it reflects decades of bad decisions about defense and about the national security threats that faces, and particularly the primary threat at this point in time from Russia.
Yeah, well, luckily the Americans don't have a veto over our Trident missiles, and it's our own nuclear warheads that are on them. But we do rely on their technology for a lot of things across the board. But the thing that most concerned me there was you saying that our national and our European and our international security is relying on hope. So, Tim, I think relying on hope is probably a good way to stop this today, because it leaves us plenty more to talk about at some stage in the future. But thank you very much indeed for talking to me once again on Frontline.
My pleasure. Good to speak.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like to be amongst the first to get exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership at the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs, or read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.